Hello, Michigan Botanical Society. I'm Bob Clips. I'm a botanist associated with The Ohio State University, and I'm here today to tell you about and show you some pictures about little plants, mosses, liverworts, and even a few hornworts. So here's a picture of two people. One of them is looking at a moss, the other one is looking at a lichen. Can you tell which is which, who is who? Probably not, unless you happen to know. The person on the left, Barb Andreas, is a bryologist looking at a moss, and the person on the right, Ray Showman, is a lichenologist looking at lichens. These two types of organisms sometimes get confused, even though they're way different. Mosses are plants, lichens are fungi, but they have a similar kind of ecology with respect to the environment. They're poikilohydric, which means that they have to subsist on whatever degree of water is in their immediate surroundings. They don't have tissues to carry water the way some plants do. And so they have a similar kind of aspect, but they're different types of organisms. Mosses and liverworts and hornworts, collectively termed bryophytes, more about that soon, are members of the plant kingdom. Plants are a clade, a branch on the tree of life, adapted for life on land. It's a terrestrial group of organisms. And this diagram shows the major groups of plants, which are sometimes called phyla and sometimes called divisions. And the angiosperms have the most adaptations for life on land, the most recently evolved plants. They have vascular tissue to carry food and water. They have um, embryos that are contained within a coat called the seed, and they have the seeds contained in a capsule called a fruit, an ovary. Conifers are naked-seeded plants. They're seed plants, and they have vascular tissue to carry food and water, good adaptations to be terrestrial, but they don't have their seeds in fruits. Uh, Ferns and some associated plants that used to be called, or sometimes are still called, fern allies, have vascular tissues, but they don't have seeds. And there are a few groups of lycopods and ferns, which reminds me, some of them have mosses in their name, but they're not mosses. Club mosses, for example, are lycophytes, which um, have their spore-producing structures in what looks like a club, but they're vascular plants. They have internal plumbing to carry food and water. They're not mosses. Similarly, spike mosses, they're not mosses either. They're another type of lycopod. And Spanish moss, over there on the right, is, of course, a flowering plant related to pineapples, I think. So the plants that are the most primitive, which we use with caution because they're not really primitive because they've been around a long, long time and they're still here. But the first types of plants to crawl up onto land are the bryophytes. And there are three groups of bryophytes. Mosses in the phylum Bryophyta, liverworts in the phylum Marcantiophyta, and hornworts in the phylum Anthoceratophyta. And one of the things about these plants is that botanists, even very accomplished ones, tend to overlook them. And why is that, we wonder? One reason is, the main reason is, I believe, that bryophytes are just small. So let's do a thought experiment. Imagine two plants, oak trees, not super hard to tell apart. White oak with the sort of uniform lobes, and bur oak with smaller lobes at the tip. Some differences in the acorns. Not too hard to tell apart, even at arm's length. But imagine if these oak trees were shrunk down to the size of, well, I don't know, an acorn. You could still tell them apart if you had microscopes. Um, Here's two mosses, which are, I guess, about the size of acorns, and they have leaves. They're totally plants. They're just a little bit difficult to differentiate without some tools of the trade. Here's a close-up of the leaves of those two different mosses, and as you can see, the one on the left, Plagionium ciliare, has leaves that are toothed all the way from tip to margin, and the one on the right, Plagionium cuspidatum, has leaves that are only toothed in the forward end of the leaf. Pretty easy to tell apart, just as easy to tell apart as bur oak and white oak. You have to look through a microscope to see those differences, or a hand lens. Which reminds me, um, when we are out in the field, botanists use um, hand lenses, sometimes called a loupe, typically about 10x. You hold it up to your eye and you hold the specimen really, really close, and you get a really nice view, about 10 power. In the lab, we use microscopes, two different types of microscopes. The dissecting microscope is basically like the same magnification as a hand lens, a little bit more, but it's used for looking at the surfaces of objects, goes from about 10 to about 45. And we also use a compound microscope, a high-powered microscope, to look at the individual leaves and stems. So, one of the things about mosses and other bryophytes, the liverworts and hornworts, is some details of the plant life cycle, which are kind of detailed, a little bit of Bio 101 here that we can't avoid. All plants, actually, but it's most evident in bryophytes, have a life cycle that's what's called the alternation of generations. That means that there's two stages or phases in the life cycle, one of which is called the sporophyte, which is a plant that produces spores, and the other stage or phase in the life cycle is the gametophyte, which is a plant that produces gametes. Spores, as we will see, are individual cells that develop into new plants all by themselves, and gametes are eggs and sperm, basically, that fuse together to form a new plant. And there's differences in the numbers of chromosome sets that these plants have. And here is a typical moss. I say mosses because what I would like to ask you is, in this picture, how many plants are there? And it's sort of a trick question, although it's just based upon knowing that there's actually two plants here. I know, it looks like one plant with a leafy bottom and an extended organ at the top, but these are actually two plants. The lower part is the stage of the life cycle that's called the gametophyte, and the upper part is the stage of the life cycle that is the sporophyte. And these are actually separate plants. The sporophyte is the offspring of the gametophyte. It's just a peculiar thing about bryophytes that the two stages of the life cycle are physically attached. The sporophyte is kind of like parasitic on its mother, basically. So let's take a look at the moss life cycle. A spore is a single cell that germinates to form the gametophyte stage of the life cycle. Before that does that, by the way, there's a stage called the protonema. And proton means before, nema is thread. And this is a thread-like stage that develops before the leafy part of the gametophyte. And it's usually a short-lived, transitory, ephemeral, not hanging around for a long time stage. But there's a few exceptions we'll see soon. So here's a picture of my favorite moss, Physcomitrium pivriforme, and it shows that protonema stage. Those green threads that look like algae, that's the protonema. And as you can see, the leafy, majorly conspicuous stage of the life cycle, sometimes called gametophores, but usually just called the gametophyte, the leafy part is developing from it. So when the gametophytes become mature, and the gametophytes are typically recognizable as plants with stems and leaves, some of them, sometimes the same one, but will have little sacs with sperm inside. It's called an antheridium. And some of them will have what looks like an egg in a bottle. And it basically is an egg in a bottle, and it's called the archegonium. And the sperm need to get to the archegonium to fertilize the egg inside with the help of environmental water. So this is sort of like a connection still with their aquatic antecedents. Instead of traveling in a pollen grain the way seed plants disperse sperm, the sperm has to swim. And then in the archegonium will be a fertilized egg, And here's a picture of my favorite moss, Viscometrium pyrrhiforme, showing these are male plants, and these are producing their gametes, their eggs and their sperm, in November. Here's a microscope view of that moss. This one actually has both sexes on the same gametophytes. So on the right is the male branch, which has antheridia in it, over here, little sacs with sperm. And the left is a female branch, which has archegonia, basically an egg in a bottle. And the sperm swims from an antheridium to an archegonium and fertilizes the egg within. So here's a moss that's growing on a little brick wall in front of my house. And it is called dwarf bristle moss, Orthotrechum pumilum. And it has, in this picture, we see both stages of the life cycle. The top part is the sporophyte, and most of what you see, the green leafy part, is the gametophyte. And if you take apart some of these stems at the right time of the year, which is late winter, some of them will have these hot dog shaped antheridia with sperm inside, and others will have what looks like an egg in a bottle, which basically is an egg in a bottle, archegonia, with eggs inside. And the sperm swims to the egg, fertilizes it, and that's when the sporophyte eventually develops. Some male mosses, the ones that have the antheridia, in order to disperse their sperm, have circular leaves, circles of leaves, whorls of leaves on the tops of the stems. This form a splash cup. This is a picture of toothed leafy moss showing these splash cups. So the thing about mosses that is noteworthy is that they really look pretty different from one another. One might think that it's undifferentiated, it's just moss, it's like a growth. But looking close up, you can see how strikingly different moss gametophytes are from each other. Different, maybe different than a lot of flowering plants that we learn to recognize. So here's some examples. This is bristle star moss, Campyllium chrysophyllum. Here's two more mosses. Look how different these leaves are. Narrow leaves of this Nium hornum, broad leaves of the Plagiarinum ciliare. Here's one that's called golden foxtail moss with narrow leaves that are a little bit folded down the length of them. Here's one called cord glaze moss with flat leaves that are acute. So the sporophytes. Sporophytes generally consist of a stalk called a seta and a single, really very large proportionally, spore case called a sporangium, sometimes called a capsule because it's so prominent. Bryophytes, and mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, the three phyla of bryophytes, are noteworthy in being monosporangiate, meaning that their sporophytes only have one sporangium. Other plants, they typically produce many sporangia, like a fern leaf is a part of a sporophyte, and lots of sporangia on the undersurface. So here's a picture of my favorite moss, Viscometrium pyrrhiforme, with nearly mature sporophytes in April. And this is a noteworthy thing about bryology, is we generally think of winter as being a dormant season, and a lot of botanists are forlorn during the winter, thinking that there's nothing to do and waiting for the spring wildflowers, which are great. But think in terms of a bryophyte. Remember a few slides ago, we looked at this moss when it was producing its gametes in November, and now we have mature or nearly mature sporophytes in April, and went from being a fertilized egg to these magnificent stalks with these capsules, actual individual plants that are almost grown up. And when did they do that growing? They did it in the freaking winter. So winter is not a dormant season for many mosses. Not only do sporophytes often grow during the winter, but so do gametophytes, and they're often evident whenever it's a little bit thaw-y, to be able to grow during the times when there's adequate moisture, and it's not frozen. So winter is a good time for botanists to look at mosses, and also is a good time for many mosses to grow. Winter is not a dormant season. And here's a picture of two mosses. I forget why I put that in there. So um, let's take a look at sporophytes. Sporophytes typically consist of a stalk, which is usually fairly long, but not always, and a single sporangium. So this moss here shows the leafy gametophyte at the bottom and the comparatively simple sporophyte attached to the gametophyte, and there's several sporophytes. There's basically about a half a dozen plants shown here. And there are some structures associated with sporophytes. There is a cap that covers young sporophytes called the calyptra. There is a lid, like a cover, called the operculum. And then finally, when the spores are ready to be released, they're released from the sporangium is often regulated by a structure called the peristome, meaning around the mouth, which typically consists of teeth that open and close with changes in humidity in order to distribute the spores at the right time to be dispersed well. So here's some pictures of sporophytes, sporangia, showing kind of intricate they are, with two cycles or circles of teeth. Here's a cemetery in central Ohio, and right in the middle on that grave marker there's a moss growing, and it's this Schistidium rivulare. And here it is in February showing sporophytes. They don't have tall capsules. This is one with sort of short sporangia that are immersed in the uppermost leaves. And this specimen here still has the calyptra. This sporophyte here still has the operculum. And then if we come, and they all actually have the operculum, and then we come a couple months later, those structures have fallen off, and we see the peristome teeth regulating the dispersal of these yellow spores. So here's a summary of the moss life cycle. A spore germinates to form first a short-lived structure, usually, called the protonema, from which develop leafy gametophores, the recognizable gametophyte stage, some stems of which have antheridia containing sperm, which release those sperm to swim to archegonia with egg at the base of each, from which develops a sporophyte, which is a different plant. It's the offspring of the female gametophyte. It just happens to peculiarly be attached to it, which typically has a stalk called the seta, a single large sporangium, sometimes called a capsule, which is covered when it's young by the calyptra, which when it's ready to release spores will fall off the operculum, and the distribution of the spores, the dispersal of the spores, is regulated by the peristome. So there are three phyla of bryophytes, the most numerous of which is mosses. And in Ohio, and Michigan is probably similar, we have 400 species of mosses. And in order to begin to recognize mosses, let's take a look at some of the features that are distinctive among the different mosses. So if you're looking to learn about them and use some field guides or lab guides, here are a few examples. A Princeton field guide called Common Mosses of the Northeast and the Appalachians by McKnight and others is a very good guide with some nice line drawings. A little more technical manual, but very good and also with drawings, and made for Michigan, is Howard Crumb's Mosses of the Great Lakes Forest. And I wrote a book. It's called Common Mosses, Liverworts, and Lichens of Ohio, published by the Ohio University Press. So, things to look at when we look at mosses. There are two major growth forms, kind of like, trees versus shrubs and woody vines, that sort of thing, in terms of growth forms. There are what are called acrocarps and pleurocarps. Acrocarps are mosses that have upright stems, acro like acrobat, growing upright, I guess, and the sporophytes, when they're produced, are at the very tips of those stems. These are often packed together into cushions, so sometimes acrocarpous mosses are called cushion mosses. Other mosses tend to be branched more, often lying a little flatter, and often are branched, and the sporophytes, when they're produced, are in the axils of the branches. And these are sometimes called carpet mosses. So here's an example of a acrocarp, a cushion moss, with upright stems and sporophytes at the very tips. It's called tight tufted thread moss. And here's a picture of a pleurocarp, a carpet moss. It's branched an awful lot. It's called Calicladium haldanianum, beautiful branch moss. So let's take a look at the things that vary among mosses. And again, many of these things are not very technical. They're just small. So leaf shape, just like any other plant, they often vary. So here's a plant called Rhizonium punctatum that has wide leaves, which are untoothed, kind of broad-leafed. Here's a really narrow-leafed one called common broom moss, Dicranum scoparium. Here's a feature that's best observed with magnification, and it is this now you're tempted to call it a vein, but it's not a vein because it's not a vascular plant. It doesn't actually have veins. It's called the costa. Sometimes it's called the nerve, and I think it helps the leaves extend out when the moisture requirements are appropriate. But the presence or absence of this costa is something which is useful in identification. So this plant has a very wide and fairly long costa. This plant, this Barbula unguiculata, beard's claw moss, has a costa that extends past the leaf tip as like an awn, well, almost an awn, a mucro. Here's a plant with a short double costa. The margins of the leaves, just like with trees and other plants, sometimes is toothed. So here are three different genera of mosses, which, by the way, used to be in the same genus, Niam. Now, only the ones that are double-toothed along the margin are in the genus Niam. Plagionium has leaves that are singly toothed, and Rhizonium has leaves that are untoothed. The shapes of the cells, only discernible through compound microscope at 100x, typically maybe from 400x, varies. So these long, narrow leaf cells in this Rhynchostegium, these diamond-shaped cells in this Hocaria, different cell leaf shapes. Some leaf cells are bumpy. That's called being papillose. Most are smooth, but many are bumpy also. And some have single stout papillae, like this common fern moss. Some have many, many small papillae. This is a microscopic feature, very distinct, just you need tools to see it. So the sporophytes also vary. Here's a picture of a plate from an article that a friend of mine wrote that discussed moss sporangia in detail. So here are some differences. On the left, we see some sporangia that are narrow, narrow and upright. Growing with it are a moss with some sporangia that are nodding. Here's a moss that's named for a feature of the sporophyte. This is common haircap moss, Polytrichum communi. Polytrichum, polytrichum means many hairs. And in this moss, the calyptra, that cap that covers the sporophyte when it's young, is composed or covered with many, many hairs, hence the name Polytrichum. Here's a moss that's closely related to Polytrichum, but its calyptra is smooth, it doesn't have hairs, and so it's called, appropriately, Atrichum. Another feature that distinguishes those mosses, the last two we looked at, they're all in the same family, the Polytrichaceae. is the feature of the capsules. And instead of having teeth that make up the peristome, well, they do have teeth, but they're fused at their tips into a disc. And so what we have instead of individual teeth to release the spores is a little series of pores right around the periphery of the mouth of the capsule. It's a very distinctive feature of the Polytrichaceae. The peristome teeth are fused into a disc. And this is Ohio haircap moss, Polytrichum ohioense. So here's a moss called Trematodon. Its common name is long-necked moss, and its capsules are very, very extended down the base, and so it has a long neck. Here's a moss called pale cowhair moss, Ditricum pallidum, and its sporophytes are so thin and upright and numerous that it looks like a tuft of grass when you see it growing on open soil and patches of woodland clearings in mid-spring. Some mosses reproduce asexually. So this is the little brick wall in front of my house where we saw the moss on the left, the Orthotrachum pusillum. Growing with it is a moss called, and often seen together, these two mosses, Orthotrachum and Centrichia, is a moss that grows on bark and on rock and is often always entirely asexual in its reproduction. So here we have actually two species, but the one I'd like to show you first is called Centrichia papillosa, and it has round gemmi. These are clusters of cells that in this case are globose that are situated along the costa of the leaves, and they break off and form new plants. There's no spores produced in this plant. And here's another species called Centrichia levipilla, which has flat, kind of leaf-like gemmi. So asexual reproduction by means of gemmi is a feature that some mosses have as their only means of reproduction, and some mosses have in addition to spore production. This is a moss called ribbed bog moss, and it's one that produces sporophytes, but also produces these asexual gemmi at the tips of stalks that kind of look like seta of sporophytes, but nope, there's not a capsule there. There's gemmi on stalks. Asexual reproduction. Here's another moss that reproduces asexually. It's called boar moss. I'd like to call it cheerleader moss, brother liana. It's got these very cheerful looking clusters of gemmi in the upper axils of leaves, and it looks to me like a cheerleader's pom-pom. Here's another thing about bryophytes is that they are very micro habitat oriented, and because they don't have tissues to transport materials very long distances, instead of thinking in terms of habitat the way we do with most plants, we can to a certain extent, but we usually think of as the substrate, the specific surface that they're growing on. And often, especially for ones that grow on rock, whether or not they're sandstony acid-based rocks or limestony calcareous rocks is a determinant of what species will occur. So this moss called sword moss, Bryophytes norvegicum, globally really rare but fairly common in the Appalachians, including parts of southern Ohio. I don't know its distribution in Michigan. Is definitely an acidophile. Here's the type of environment that it grows in, these deep recesses that are perennially moist and very shady, and on sandstone. Here's a moss that grows on limestone. It's a lime-loving bryophyte called blunt pocket moss. And I made a mistake here. I did a copy-paste thing. The name of this moss is not what it says here. It is Physidens obtusifolius. And this is the limestone that it's growing on. Here's a poem with some scientific names that is, in cracks in cement, plants of Bryum argenteum grow. Its silvery sheen and small size makes it easy to know. Nutrient-carrying water dripping down tree trunks nourishes Platygium repens, hiding in bark fissures where it flourishes. Under oaks and dry soil, Leucobrium glaucum abounds, and with it dark green tufts of Dicranum scoparium are found. Anomodon attenuatus skirts hardwood tree trunks up 3 feet, while a cousin, A minor and others, make the bark flora complete. Hedwigia, Schistidium, and more prefer sunny, dry rocks, either sandstone or limestone, but usually slump blocks. Identifying mosses using keys can sometimes be strenuous, but learning mosses by habitat makes identification less tenuous. Thank you, Barb Andreas. So, I'd like to show you some easily recognized mosses and start with ones that are kind of like, kind of weird in a ways. So, a typical moss that looks more or less like this diagram has an upright gametophyte with leaves that are spirally arranged and a sporophyte with a fairly tall stalk and a single sporangium. Some mosses that strikingly vary from this are the following. So, sphagnum is a large genus, cosmopolitan, generally goes in wet acidic sites, and sphagnum, seen through the microscope, has leaves that with cells that are striking. There are 2 types of cells. The thick network is the green photosynthetic cells, and the hollow clear areas in this picture are dead, large, hollow, empty cells with holes in them that are capable of absorbing water, which is why sphagnum moss is famous for absorbing water very well. It does it in gardens as a soil amendment, and it does it in their natural and boggy environment, gain a lot of stature without a lot of biomass. So that's a very striking thing that makes sphagnum moss be distinctive right off the bat. The mosses in the Polytrichaceae, we've already met haircat moss and saw some features of the sporophyte, features of the gametophyte of the members of the Polytrichaceae. They have leaves that are not simple 1-cell thick jabberoos, but are rather a few cells thick, but most importantly have lamellae, ribbons of cells running lengthwise, sometimes aggregated at the costa and sometimes spread across nearly the whole leaf. And this is a picture of Atricum. Here's a microscope view of it. See, we have these lamellae, these ribbons of cells running lengthwise down the leaf, a very distinctive Polytrichaceae feature. Here's a moss that's strikingly different. It's called algal haircap moss, Pogonatum pennsylvanicum, and it's a moss that has the usually transitory short-lived ephemeral, now you see it, now you don't, protonema stage, that thread-like stage, as a persistent major contributor to the photosynthetic apparatus of the plant. The gametophytes are really, really small. Sporophytes are really big. It kind of looks like a haircat moss, because it kind of is, but it has a persistent protonema and a teeny gametophyte. Very distinctive. Pincushion moss and the genus Leucobrium. Most mosses have leaves that are 1-cell thick. Leucobrium, which has, as a result of this peculiar leaf anatomy, with a narrow layer of green cells and a few layers of hollow, thin, dead, empty cells, a kind of ghostly, whitish, sort of succulent appearance. Pincushion moss. Very distinctive, easy to recognize moss. Here's one called nut moss. It's whimsically called scared rabbits in the grass. It's Difficium foliosum, and it's got these sessile, stalkless sporophytes with just the capsule showing, and narrow leaves that kind of look like grass. Nut moss. And here's the most unique bryophyte of them all, one might say. It's called Goblin's Gold, Schistostega pinnata. It's a very rare northern moss that occurs in very dark shaded recesses. And what's special about it, in addition to the fact that its leaves are 2-ranked, which is kind of unusual for mosses, its protonema has cells that capture light by lens-like openings And the result is a peculiar iridescence almost. If you look into the recesses where they're growing, it appears to be glowing. It doesn't produce light, it just reflects light, kind of like a cat's eyes do. And it's goblin's gold. It's Schistostigma pinnata, a remarkable bryophyte. So let's take a look at some common mosses growing in different situations. So let's start by looking at mosses growing on the ground. This is a moss called Climacerium americanum. It's called tree moss, and it's actually a pleurocarp, a carpet moss, but it's got spreading stems and then branches that go upright and branch again, and they look like little trees. A very distinctive moss. Here's one called windswept broom moss. It's Dicranum scoparium, and it's a fairly robust cushion moss, aquacarp, with linear leaves that are swept to one side, looking like it's in a windstorm. And that's Dicranum. Here's another species of Dicranum that has the leaves that are a little broader and more evenly distributed around the stem, and a very velvety tomentum on the stem, a feature that kind of might substitute for vascular tissue by being able to wick up moisture from the ground in somewhat the same way that xylem might in a vascular plant. Here's bird's claw beard moss, Barbula unguiculata. Its leaf tips end in sharp points. It's a really common one on disturbed soil, farm fields, and paths. And here's one we glimpsed before in the gametophyte stage, though. This is Atricum alticristatum, ridged smooth cap moss. And here it is with some microscope views showing a cross section showing the lamellae, and a picture of the leaf showing again the lamellae along the surface of the costa, a common woodland moss. Here's a railroad track in central Ohio where a common annual moss grows. This is a moss that sometimes grows in fire pits, so it's called fire moss, and it's Funaria hygrometrica, water measuring cord moss, I like to call it. It has long, slender setae that support the obliquely pear-shaped capsules that the seta bend and flex with changes in humidity, kind of slowly and gradually, but they orient the capsules in different ways to help distribute the spores. Down below is the gametophyte, and mostly you see a whole lot of sporophyte. Big devotion to reproduction, which is common for annual plants. Let's take a look at some mosses on logs. This is a moss called curveleaf brocade moss. It's a pleurocarp, it's a branched moss, which most log mosses are, and it's feather-like in its branching, and the leaves are sickle-shaped and swept to one side, giving it a nice braided sort of appearance. And here it is with sporophytes. These sporophytes look to me kind of like some kind of herons or cranes or something. These appear in the spring. There are two mosses that look really, really similar. One of them is the one we just looked at. And I made a mistake with the labeling over here, but what it should show on the right is the Caliargonella curvifolia, and the one on the left is Hypnum imponens. Two different mosses in two different genera, and actually in two different families whose gametophytes look really, really similar. But if you look through a microscope, you can see some striking differences in the leaf shape. The way this is swept with this sharp angle in the curveleaf brocade moss, and the way it's more gradual in the pellucid plate moss. Microscopes help for identification, but not always necessary, especially once you get a feel for it. Field recognition of many of these mosses is nonetheless possible. Here's a very, very abundant moss, and a very distinctive one called fern moss, Thuidium delicatulum. And it's branched and branched again, kind of looking very feathery or very ferny. And through a microscope, its stems are clothed in what's called paraphylia, slender, hair-like or leaf-like, sort of in between the two appendages that, again, probably act to wick up moisture. Here's one called Platygerrium repens. In McKnight's and others' Princeton Field Guide, they have a lot of interesting common names, and that one, this is called oil spill moss, because it has a sort of dingy, dank, kind of looking greasy appearance. It's Platygerrium repens. It's very common on decorticated wood, not the most striking moss, but very interesting because it reproduces both sexually by the production of sporophytes, abundantly, small ones, upright, with narrow sporangia, and also asexually by producing these clusters of brood branches. They give it sort of like a dreadlocky appearance. And again, mosses that reproduce both ways, generally the gemmy, since they're heavy and expensive to make, they're useful for spreading on an existing site where it's obviously favorable for the growth of that moss. And the spores generally are for long distance dispersal to find new sites to colonize. Two different modes of reproduction, one for spreading on a site, one for going to new sites. Woodsy leafy moss, Plagionium cuspidatum, a very, very common moss, with leaves that are broad, toothed halfway down the margin. Kind of reminds me of cherry leaves. On the right, we can see the leaf. On the left, we see the capsules of the sporophyte with its peristome teeth. So let's take a look at some mosses found on bark. This is a genus called bristle moss, Orthotrichum. We met an Orthotrichum already on the brick wall in front of my house. This is one that's common on trees. It's called Orthotrichum pusillum, tiny bristle moss. And it has immersed capsules, probably because it's already high up in the air. It doesn't need to elevate the spores. It's growing on a tree. And it's an acrocarp. Here's one that's similar to Orthotrichum. It's called Eulota, and it has somewhat emergent capsules. In other words, a substantial seta to the sporophytes. And the capsules are kind of hairy, and the leaves are very crispy and curled. Eulota crispa, or Eulota crispula. I think they changed the name. Here's one that's called knothole moss, and it's named appropriately for its substrate. It tends to grow in crotches of trees, sometimes knotholes, parts of trees that are persistently moist. Anacaptodon splachnoides. So here's a very, very common moss that's often found as a tree apron, wrapping around the base of a tree. It's called Anomodon attenuatus, but they changed the name recently, and now it's Pseudoanomodon attenuatus, and it's a tree apron moss. Here it is showing why it's called attenuatus. The branches tend to taper. The leaves are a little bit smaller towards the tip, and it gives it a kind of a pointed look to the branches. And there's also the leaves are also a little pointed. Here's another moss that often grows as a tree apron, and I forgot to delete the word attenuatus. It's called Cleopodium rostratum. And it's velvet tree apron moss, and it has bumpy leaves that you can see through the microscope, pointed leaves, tree apron moss, velvet tree apron moss. Gosh, why did I not delete that word attenuatus when I did my copying and pasting? Heavens. And it has long pointed leaves, and here it is with a few sporophytes too. Here's a species called Anomodon minor. It's blunt-leafed Anomodon moss. Tends to grow higher on tree bark, and it has leaves. Through the microscope or hand lens, you can see that they're very blunt. And here's a picture of this blunt-leaved Anomodon moss, Anomodon minor. If you don't see moss in every nook, be sure to take a closer look. Some mosses are dull, others are shiny. Some are small, some even tiny. Hypnum on a creepy log, sphagnum in a sloshy bog, bryum in a sidewalk crack. What's that in the lawn out back? Aprons on a tree? It's a nomadon you see. Thank you, Jim Toppin. So let's take a look at some mosses growing on rock. Here is, well, there's a lichen growing on this rock called smoky-eyed boulder lichen, and also the subject of this slide, this talk, a moss. And here they are growing together. And here's this cartoon that I like that rock reminds me of. It's by Tom Gault, Moss versus Lichen. They look like friends growing on the rock, right? They're like they're buddies. They're probably mortal enemies trying to take over each other's area. Oh, moss, this is my stone. No, it's not. 10 years later, 50 years later, 100 years later, you'll be sorry when I get there. You're the one who will be sorry. Here's a moss called Hedwig's ciliate moss. And the wonderfully evocative common names in the Princeton Field Guide includes Medusa moss for this one because it's sporophyte with its immersed capsule. Kind of looks like a big eyeball. And it's a very, very common moss on rocks, which also depicts how strikingly different some mosses can be when they're dry versus when they're moist. Again, they're poikilohydric. They need to be able to dry out and not suffer, and be able to quickly absorb moisture when there is some, and continue their photosynthetic life. Here it is when it's dry, and here it is when it's moist. And here's a moss called apple moss, Vitramia pomiformis. Apple moss. Easier to use but more expensive than Windows moss. Huh. He thinks he's funny. So let's take a look at some other bryophytes. The other bryophytes, which are liverworts. And these are bryophytes that are in a different phylum called Microhabitats. In Ohio, there's maybe about 200. We're not sure exactly. We're still censusing them. Probably the same in Michigan. And the thing about liverworts is that, surprise, most of them don't look like livers. And so most of them are leafy and can be confused with mosses. And we'll contrast them right away. So in this little slide that introduces them, up in the upper left are some that are sort of they have what's called a thalloid growth form, undifferentiated growth form, not a lot of intricacy, and sort of looks like a liver, I guess. And other ones are leafy. So here's a chart that shows the difference between the major groups of between the groups of bryophytes. And let's notice that for mosses versus liverworts, liverworts can have this thalloid, is the technically correct way to say it, growth form that's undifferentiated, kind of flat, kind of like blah, like strap-shaped or tongue-shaped, but some of them are leafy. The symmetry in liverworts is different. The leafy ones tend to have bilateral symmetry. They have leaves that are left and right splayed out along the sides, 2 rows, right across from each other, and on the undersurface there's a row of smaller leaves, reduced leaves. And the sporophytes in liverworts are very short-lived and very simple compared with the sporophytes of mosses, as I will show you shortly. And there's some features of the cells that are different too. Liverworts have these things called oil bodies. So here we have liverwort sporophytes. So they're really, really wimpy. They typically only last a day or two. They have a seta that consists of these really thin, kind of juicy, nearly transparent cells, and the sporophyte looks like a little tiny little olive, and it doesn't have those intricate structures, like the peristome and the calyptra and the operculum, and they just release the spores really quickly and collapse right afterwards. So you don't often see liverwort sporophytes. There's not much to them. But what they don't have in sporophytes, they more than make up for often in the intricacy of their gametophytes. Liverwort gametophytes are sometimes lobed, which moss gametophytes never are. They're sometimes elaborately toothed, and they have an intricacy. They can have an intricacy that exceeds that of mosses. And as mentioned, there's this internal feature, these structures called oil bodies, and they are vary in number and size and are sometimes useful in identification. So, um, some liverworts, however, do kind of look like a liver if you um, have an active imagination, and of course contributed to the ancient doctrine of signatures, which suggested that plants had a function or a utility that was suggested by the organ of the body that they resembled, which they would cure ailments of. So the liverworts looked like the liver, they would cure liver ailments. It's called the doctrine of signatures. So some liverworts are what are called complex thalloid liverworts with elevated receptacles. It's a little bit complicated, but this structure here that I'm circling, you might think, based on what we've learned so far, that it's the sporophyte. It's not quite. It's actually the sporophytes is just tucked under the cap of this mushroom-like thing. And it's actually gametophyte tissue that sort of supports where the gametes are produced. And that's what these are called, receptacles. And this is a fairly unusual one called Marcantia quadrata. It grows on limestone. And here's a close-up of the sporangio of the receptacle. And this structure here and this structure here, there might be one or two more, are the capsules of the sporophytes. So the sporophytes are produced on the undersurface of this receptacle, sometimes called the gametangiophore. And that's what these are. Complex thalloid liverworts with elevated receptacles. The most common and well-known liverwort of them all is called common liverwort, Marcantia polymorpha. And it's the liverwort that shows up in botany texts, principally because it shows up in the greenhouses at the institutions where the writers of the botany texts write their botany texts, because it's a common weedy liverwort that grows in flower pots, in nurseries, and sometimes on fire pits and also undisturbed situations. It also reproduces, Marcantia polymorpha does. Interestingly, um, it has these receptacles. By the way, the merely scalloped ones are the ones that produce the sperm, and the deeply scalloped ones are the ones where the sporophytes eventually emerge, the female ones. But it also reproduces asexually, producing these gemmy, these cups that look like little birds' nests. And each one of these little eggs in the bird's nest, which are not eggs, a lot of air quotes here, are gemmy, little clusters of cells that can fly out and be splashed out and make new plants all by themselves. So here's another complex thalloid liverwort with elevated receptacles, and this is a very well-known one, very abundant especially on sandstone, but sometimes on limestone. It's called Conocephalum, and it's has a very reticulated surface. It's called snakeskin liverwort. It also, if it's really abundant, you could break off a little piece without hurting anything, scratch and sniff. It has a really peculiar smell, kind of like grapefruit, maybe citrusy, sort of pungent smell. So some liverworts are thalloid, but they're not complex thalloid liverworts. They're simpler structures of their gametophytes, and also the sporophytes are typical liverwort sporophytes with that thin evanescent stalk and a little olive-like sporangium. This is called pellia. Here's another simple thalloid liverwort called Lyell's ribbonwort, Palavicinia lyellii. And here's a simple thalloid liverwort called forked veilwort, Metzgeria furcata. It's very one cell thick, very thin, delicate liverwort. Here it is through the microscope, showing how it often reproduces. It produces these bud-like gemmy, reproducing asexually. Metzgeria furcata. So here's a liverwort that demonstrates dramatically. Unfortunately, the way this PowerPoint is recording, there's me right in front of this picture I wanted to show you. Get out of the way, me. That shows that these leaves of liverworts can be very elaborate. This is called tree fringewort. It's got leaves that are deeply lobed with frilly-like cilia at the margins of them. Just really striking. Tolidium pulcherrimum. So, leafy liverworts can be distinguished on the basis of the ways in which their leaves overlap. You'll see that their leaves are slanted and they overlap each other, kind of like Venetian blinds, and kind of like Venetian blinds that you can rotate to have them the slats run one way or the other way. So leafy liverworts can be distinguished by being either what's called incubus, which means that the leaves are slanted kind of backward, or the other term is called succubus, which the leaves are slanted sort of forward. And this is a leafy liverwort with an incubus insertion and leaves that are toothed. It's a very well-known one called Byzania trilobita. It grows typically in mounds on the ground in hemlock forests, sometimes on rocks too, typically acidic. And here's a picture of the undersurface of that Byzania, showing you the reduced underleaves that are characteristic of leafy liverworts. Here's a plant called Calipagea, which is a leafy liverwort with entire leaves, by which I mean that they're not toothed or folded over in any way. It's Muller's pouchwort. Here's some leaves that have a succubus insertion, means that they're slanted forward, and they're toothed. This is called greater featherwort. And about this picture, it's also shown with a moss called Physidens, which has leaves that are coming off in two directions, two opposite rows, two ranked, which is unusual for mosses, but this genus Physidens is noteworthy for having it. And here's a liverwort. Well, I like it when plants that have the same kind of growth form, but that aren't closely related, grow together. And here we have a moss and a liverwort that kind of look superficially similar, sharing the same substrate, mingling. Here is a liverwort with a succubus leaf insertion, leaf slanted forward, and a lobed leaf. It's called Lophicolia heterophylla, variable crestwort. Some liverworts are really, really small. And so this scene is about 3/4 of an inch across. It's called Cephalosia rubella. It's a very delicate, thin liverwort. Here it is through the microscope, showing some rhizoids, showing these fairly large cells. Cephalosia. Here's a plant called Odontoscisma, bog moss flapwort, which reproduces asexually. See these upright stems with these little yellow pom-poms? Here we go through the microscope. We see that these little pom-poms are clusters of single-celled gemmy that produce new plants. So here's a log that looks kind of like it's been painted green. The individual plants are very difficult to discern at the typical distance that you see that at. It typically grows on decorticated, bark-free logs. It's very, very abundant and fairly common. It's called wood rust pincerwort, Noelia curvifolia. And here it is through the microscope. Excuse me, not through the microscope. Here it is just a macro photo, and growing with Lophicolia heterophylla. This Noelia has leaves that are deeply concave, kind of whimsically resembling sailing ships with deeply billowed sails racing across the sea. It's like a little regatta. So here's a liverwort, which, well, Marcantia is probably the best known liverwort. I contend that perhaps this liverwort is the most frequently observed liverwort, but maybe cryptically, maybe not with people knowing that it's a liverwort. Many, many trees in the forest, especially like maple trees, have on their bark, high up, fairly abundant sometimes, these sort of splayed, like target-like, spiderweb-like dark patches on them, which is a leafy liverwort that grows on bark. It's called New York scalewort, Frulania eboracensis. Um, the category it belongs to is it has leaves that are folded. It's called being complicate bilobe, folded kind of like a mitten, an individual leaf with a lower lobe and an upper lobe. And sometimes the upper lobe is larger, sometimes it's smaller. So this moss called Frulania eboracensis, here it is, what it might look like close up. And here it is through the microscope. The lower lobes of the leaf are modified into these like little pitchers, and the upper lobes look more like what you'd expect, like our leafy. And this is Frulania. Here's a fun little picture. Um, every so often, these pitcher-like lower lobes are filled with fluid and a rotifer. This is an animal called a rotifer, sort of filter-feeding animal with these little spinning cilia. It's a rotifer living in the lobule of a liverwort. So here is a cemetery in central Ohio, and this is a monument that's made out of what I think must be the worst material ever to choose for building a structure that you want to persist in perpetuity. It's some sort of limestone, I guess, that is just very, very erodible with moisture, with rainwater. It's falling apart, but it's a substrate for this really nice liverwort called Porella platyphila, and it's called wall scale wort, and it has complicate bilobes, leaves that are folded like a mitten. The larger lobe is on the top. Here's a picture of it. Same species, growing on a tree, looking a little more lush, just because of the conditions when the photo was taken. The undersurface is really, really intricate. Kind of looks like something that the artist M.C. Escher would draw with the way it integrates. Here's a different species of Porella called Porella pinnata, a nearly aquatic liverwort, kind of unusual habitat for liverworts. Porella pinnata. So here are some leafy liverworts that have leaves that are complicate bilobed, in other words, folded like a mitten, with the smaller lobe on top. And this one is called sharp-pointed earwort, Diplophyllum apiculatum. Fairly common, fairly abundant in shaded acidic sandstone. And on the left and on the right are two different liverworts that have that same characteristic. Complicate bilobe with a smaller lobe on top. And notice that in the earwort, the sharp-pointed earwort, the lobes kind of go towards the tip, whereas with the grove earwort, they're a little more splayed outward. Here's a liverwort that can't seem to make up its mind if it's leafy or thalloid, and it's called a leafy thalloid liverwort. The genus is called Fossum bronia, and they look like little heads of lettuce with these bowling ball-like sporangia, very abundant. And oh, by the way, another feature of liverwort sporophytes, which is shown in this little cartoony sketch that is through a microscope, is these cells called elaters. They're spiral cells that burst open with changes in humidity. When they get moist, they spring out and they help disperse the spores. They're called elaters. Liverwort thing. So, finally, let's take a wee look at the third and final phylum of liverworts. It's, phylum of bryophytes. And if liverworts were the other bryophytes, then hornworts, the phylum Anthoceratophyta, are the other bryophytes. And this is a group which is really small. There's only about 300 species worldwide, and it's mainly tropical. And there are in Ohio, and probably Michigan too, only 3 of them. Only 2 of which are fairly common, and hornworts. As the name implies, the sporophyte is often shaped like a horn, and the gametophyte looks sort of like a thalloid liverwort, and they're always included in liverwort books because I guess a hornwort book would be a very small book, and they do resemble liverworts. They have some interesting ecology. They have little pockets of cells that blue-green bacteria live in and help fix nitrogen. That's a very, very unusual symbiosis for plants. And the sporophytes, as mentioned, are typically, at least in most genera, shaped like horns. And they tend to grow in disturbed places, or sometimes wet rocks in streams or on cliff faces. This one was photographed on a power line right-of-way. So here's another genus of liverworts. It's called Notothelus, and it's kind of peculiar because I misspoke. Hornworts, Notothelus, and it's peculiar because its sporophytes don't stick upright like horns. They lay sort of flat, like flat horns. Here's a little annotation of this diagram to show you where in the picture the sporophytes are, because they don't stick up or out very far. They kind of lay flat like little fingers, but it's a sporophyte nonetheless. It's called Notothelus orbicularis, and it was growing here with some mosses. So, if you're interested in learning about liverworts, here's a book that I like. It's called The Liverworts of New England by Mary Lincoln. And we'll close with a poem or something, a little epithet. It is the office of the naturalist, no less than that of the poet, to call attention to objects that are neglected because they are familiar or obscure, to show the beauty and the charm that lie hidden in common things, to give eyes where there have been no eyes, to dispel the lethargy of the mind, and to quicken the spirit to admiration and to love. Thank you for your attention. And if you're interested in bryophytes, you may want to become associated with, to join or coordinate with the Ohio Moss and Lichen Association. We have several out-of-state members, and we have 2 forays each year and a website, ohiomosslichen.org, and a friendly group of people that would like to share our enthusiasm for mosses and lichens and liverworts and hornworts with you. Thank you for your